Good afternoon, Valeriy Viktorovich.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, dear viewers, audio listeners, and comrades in the studio. Today is May 19th, 2025. On May 16th, negotiations were held in Turkey between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations. Following these negotiations, Western media outlets, including The Guardian, The New York Times, CNN, and others, characterized the negotiations in Istanbul as a victory for Russian President Vladimir Putin. Phrases such as "the talks went more positively than expected" and "the negotiations in Istanbul are being described as a tactical victory for Putin" appeared in their coverage. Valeriy Viktorovich, what is this? Is it truly a victory for Russia in the negotiations? Or is the West trying to deceive us once again?
Judging by the West's reaction and by what followed the negotiations, it's quite clear that the West is in complete disarray. To understand what happened, we need to look at how the negotiations were conducted, the environment in which they took place, and the underlying basis for these negotiations. As Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War, strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory, but tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. Why do I quote Sun Tzu? Because the New York Times referred to the recent negotiations as a tactical victory for Putin. But that is precisely the essence of all external, internal, and global politics. Russia is practically deprived of the ability to carry out tactical actions that would lead to tactical victories for Russia. The reason lies in the fact that those in charge, the so-called Russian elite, are overwhelmingly Russophobic and dream of subjugating themselves to the West. They are willing to do anything for a chance to lick their Western master's ass. And that anything includes advancing the West's goal of destroying Russia and the Russian people. This is something we can now see with complete clarity. The thing is, many among us treat this as a given, as if it doesn't influence any of the processes at play. They believe that Putin, by taking certain actions, can achieve both tactical and strategic victories. In reality, the negotiations in Istanbul represent an undeniable strategic victory for Russia, and many people will still have to come to terms with that. They'll need to recognize the difference between the negotiations that took place in 2022 and those that began in Istanbul on May 16th. Perhaps these negotiations will continue, perhaps not. but they are fundamentally different from the ones held in 2022. Fundamentally different. Back then, the entire Russian elite was dreaming of surrender. They believed that Russia was on the brink of collapse, and that the West would seize the wealth they had stolen from the people. That's why they were ready to agree to complete capitulation on any terms that offered even a slight benefit to themselves, including reparations and everything else. This time, however, the negotiations took place on Russia's terms. Putin is maneuvering very skillfully within the real political circumstances. And to understand the conditions under which Russia entered these negotiations, one must consider how Russia is perceived in the West, and how this very same Russian elite behaves. We often hear from Western voices that there's no need to fear Russia, no need to fear its nuclear weapons. They won't be used. When prominent figures say things like this, it gets picked up by the media. When similar statements are made, they appear in the media. Just this week, there was a report about Stubb explaining to Trump that Russia is not a sovereign or independent state, that despite its size, its industry, and everything else, Russia is no different from any former colonial country in Africa. It's essentially the same. Stubb even pointed to one of the indicators. Look at the lending rate in Russia, set by the central bank. It's 20%. No sovereign country sets such high interest rates. This is clearly a country dependent on the West. Why is he saying this to Trump? Because he's appealing to the idea that Russia is a rebellious country that needs to be brought back into submission. The implication is clear. There's no point in negotiating with Russia if it's just a rebellious country. Did Stubb's statement receive proper coverage in our media? Absolutely not. But suddenly, among the patriotic public, people began saying, "Look at that. Stubb let something slip." Well then, all we can do is spread our hands in confusion. What exactly did he let slip? What did he say that supposedly revealed some great secret no one already knew? Yes, working within the Western information space has become nearly impossible for us. We can't operate there without a VPN, and even many VPNs don't work because we're constantly being blocked. The goal is to prevent us from reading Western media or accessing Western sources of information. YouTube was shut down for us. And why was all this done? To keep us from understanding the real state Russia is in, and from seeing what the Russian elite, the people currently running the country, truly represent.
уже давным-давно при рассуждении о дееспособности
In the West, for
России
quite some time now, discussions about Russia's viability as a functioning state often point to indicators that paint Russia as a third world country, one that doesn't need to be taken seriously.
когда французские генералы смеются в ответ на то, что Россия может ударить ядерным оружием, они на это
So when
делают
French generals laugh at the
как
idea that Russia might launch a nuclear strike, they do so for specific reasons. They understand Russia's actual condition.
А в каком
So, what is
состоянии
Russia's
находится
actual
Россия?
condition?
Итак, Ступ типа проговорился, что у России ставка кредитования является общей для
Stubbs
того,
supposedly
что
lets slip that Russia's lending rate is typical of what's seen in third world countries. But in
мы
reality,
говорим,
he didn't let anything
это
slip at all.
уже давным-давно обсуждается в
This has
экспертно-аналитическом
long been a
сообществе
topic of
на
discussion
Западе,
within the
когда
Western
они
expert and analytical community
разбираются,
when
а
assessing
Россия
whether
суверенная
Russia
страна
is a
или
sovereign
несуверенная.
state.
И они
And their
говорят,
conclusion is
нет,
clear:
она
no,
абсолютно не
it's
суверенная,
absolutely not
она
sovereign. It's a
колониальная
colonial
страна,
country,
она
a raw
соревнуется
material
с
appendage
Западом.
of the
Весь
West.
вопрос только в том, что колониализм России
The only
оформлен
nuance, they say,
как
is that
колониальная
Russia's colonial
страна,
status is
которая
amorphously structured.
Россию
There isn't one clearly defined
колонизировала.
colonizing
А
country.
почему это
Why?
происходит? А потому что
Because
Россия
Russia is
слишком
simply too
огромна.
vast.
Сначала
First,
Россию
it needs to
нужно
be broken
раздробить.
apart.
Что делал у
And what
нас
was Dmitry
Виктор
Anatolyevich
Анатольевич,
Medvedev doing?
выкручивая руки субъектам федерации, что он не будет
By
перечислять
twisting the
кредиты,
arms of
он
federal subjects,
заставлял
threatening to cut off
формировать
budgetary transfers.
вместо
He forced them to replace
администрации
local administrations with
правительство
full-fledged regional
субъектов
governments.
федерации. Он
He was
готовил
preparing the country
расчленению
for
страны.
fragmentation.
Это на
And the
Западе
West sees
прекрасно
all of
видно.
this perfectly clearly.
Когда вспоминают, когда не вспоминают, но есть три основных
Sometimes it's mentioned
признака,
explicitly,
когда
sometimes not.
на
But there are
Западе
three main
государственное
indicators that the Western expert and analytical community consistently cite when arguing that Russia is not a sovereign state.
Так вот, первый признак – это
The
как
first
раз
indicator
вот
is the
эта
key interest
ставка.
rate.
Ставка, которую
The rate currently set in
ставит
Russia is unlike
страны
anything
первого
seen in
мира
first
и
world
даже
or even
второго
second world
мира.
countries.
Они такую ставку не назначают, потому что эта ставка разгоняет инфляцию,
Such a
обесценивает
rate
труд
accelerates
людей
inflation,
и
devalues
все
labor,
ресурсы
and
страны
effectively
отдает
hands over the
прямо
country's resources to foreign powers at little or no
государству.
cost.
Мало того, что
But it's not
существует
just the
такая
existence
ставка,
of such a
которая
rate
уничтожает
which
все
destroys
производство
domestic
внутри страны,
production. There's more.
западное экспертно-аналитическое сообщество говорит: посмотрите, разве может быть суверенной страной государство, которое определяет свой бюджет, исходя из
Western analysts also point
наличия у
out,
него
can a state truly be sovereign if it
золотой
bases its
запасы
national budget on the amount
какой-то
of specific
конкретной
foreign
валюты
currency in its gold and
и
foreign exchange reserves,
сообразно
and
курсу
ties the flow of money
обеспечивает
into the
экономику
economy
страны
to exchange
деньгами?
rates?
Нет, потому что получается ситуация. Вот ты услужил господину, он
Their
тебе
answer is
денежку
clear.
дал.
No.
На эту
Why?
денежку ты
Because this
можешь
creates a
купить
situation where, if
или
you
тому
serve your
подобное,
master, he gives you money.
одежду,
With that money, you can
еду.
buy or produce food,
Вот. А
clothing,
если
and
ты
other
не
essentials.
услужил
But if you
господину,
don't serve
у
him,
тебя
there's
денег
no
на
money in
кухне
your
нет.
economy.
Ты сам не имеешь права использовать свой труд
You're not allowed to use your
себе
own
во
labor for your own
благо.
benefit.
Ты формируешь бюджет государства только и
Instead,
исключительно
your national
в
budget
рамках
is shaped entirely by
наличных
how
у
much
тебя
foreign currency you
валют.
hold.
И если у тебя валюты мало, значит ты обесцениваешь ее для того, чтобы у тебя
And if that amount is
обесцениваешь свою
low, you
национальную
devalue your own
для
currency
того,
just
чтобы
to refill
пополнить
the
бюджет.
budget.
Но мы же это видим по
But we can
нашему
see this
бюджету.
dynamic in our own
Когда
budget
нам
when the central
Центробанк
bank
говорит,
tells
надо
us we
опускать
need to weaken
инфляцию,
the
а
ruble in
наполнить
order to
деньги
fill the
бюджета.
budget with money.
Минуточку. Но Центробанк
Hold on a minute. Central bank, if you're saying we don't have enough foreign currency, then why are you against requiring a full, mandatory sale of that currency to the state? If it were 100% mandatory, then by your own logic, there would be no need to devalue labor. There would be enough foreign currency to issue money against it, and the economy could continue functioning as before.
Но Центробанк говорит, нет, значит, вы должны абсолютно даром поставлять ресурсы на Запад,
But the central bank says, no, you must supply your resources to the West essentially for free. Meanwhile, at home, your labor must be worth less and less, and your resources must become cheaper and cheaper. In other words, what used to cost $100 should now cost $1. So for $1, we should be able to buy more than we previously could for $100. And for $100, we're now buying 100 times more than we used to for that same amount. So the West sees this. The West evaluates and understands Russia's colonial status. True, it doesn't always flaunt that colonial status when dealing with other countries. Take Saudi Arabia, for example. What do they always say? Saudi Arabia, facing a budget deficit, is forced to sell more oil to obtain foreign currency and fund its budget. But that's exactly what colonial status is. What a state truly is described in detail in the 3-volume work War State Bolshevism. In fact, I'm essentially paraphrasing it here, piece by piece. But it's better to read the book for yourself. What is the third indicator that Russia is a colonial country? It's the one I've already mentioned, the exchange rate. Not only do we build our budget entirely around how much we serve the West and how much the West gives us in return, but the West, through its instruments, specifically its subversive and terrorist group operating inside Russia. The central bank, headed by Nabiullina, actively limits our ability to use incoming foreign currency for the benefit of the Russian population. They are categorically opposed to allowing that foreign currency to enter Russia's reserves and be used as a foundation for issuing money and supporting the economy. And what does that mean? It means the goal is to crash the economy at any cost, to push the population into poverty and extinction. The West sees this very clearly. And because there is little foreign currency available under this colonial system, the ruble must be devalued. Labor and resources must be cheapened so that the master can extract them from Russia for next to nothing. So, based on these 3 indicators, the entire Western expert and analytical community consistently argues that Russia is not a sovereign state, that it depends entirely on the West. If the West doesn't supply foreign currency, Russia effectively has no economy. Everything collapses because the Russ-Scion elite manage the Russian economy exactly that way. Hence the laughter from the French generals when they say, haha, Russia strike us with a nuclear weapon? Nonsense. They wouldn't dare. Just look at how their economy and state governance are structured. They've built everything to serve us. And in their view, the only real problem is Putin. It's Putin who stands in the way of the destruction of the Russian people. That's why he must be removed, because he still aligns himself with the Russian people. And somehow, despite everything, despite the existence of so-called patriotic outlets like SberCard, they still haven't succeeded in establishing fascism in Russia. So when someone makes a statement, and it reaches us, that at first glance seems like nonsense, have they lost their minds over there? The answer is no. They are objectively assessing the actions of our Rus Zion elite. But the West still has one key misunderstanding. Why haven't they been able to punish Putin? Why haven't they succeeded in forcing Russia into submission? After all, the special military operation for demilitarization and denazification, launched by Russia, was something they provoked and prepared. We've said repeatedly, their goal is war, a war that must inevitably engulf both Europe and Russia. In Europe, the goal is the destruction of existing states and the eventual creation of a European Islamic Caliphate. In Russia, the goal is the dismemberment of the country into fragmented souvenir states, each one becoming a colonial holding under different foreign powers. And by the way, this is also the underlying logic behind the so-called rare earth metals deal that Trump is making with Ukraine.
Полное подчинение россионской элиты России интересам Запада, проведению управления в интересах.
So, seeing the complete subordination of the Rus Zion elite to Western interests and their governance serving Western interests, the West continues to shape and pursue its anti-Russian, anti-Russia policy accordingly.
И потому-то Запад взвинчивает ставки. Он постоянно видит.
That's why the West keeps raising the stakes. It sees that no matter how far it escalates, Russia keeps giving in, and has been doing so for 3 years straight. Let me remind you, at first, the West was afraid to even send sleeping bags and helmets. Now, they have no hesitation in supplying any kind of weapon. What's more, there are already discussions underway. Why not give nuclear weapons to Ukraine? Let it use them against Russia. The West can claim it had nothing to do with it, and Russia wouldn't dare strike back at Western countries. The West creates the appearance that it has nothing to do with the war, despite the fact that, under all norms of international law and the entire history of warfare, it is clearly a direct and full-fledged participant in the war against Russia, even engaging through its own armed forces.
70 французских офицеров, более 70 французских офицеров, находившихся в командировке на Украине.
More than 70 French officers have been killed while deployed in Ukraine, including one general whose death had to be covered up. The official story? He went hiking in the mountains at night and somehow fell off a cliff. But Western countries want to enter Ukraine under their national flags. Why? Because they're convinced that Russia won't strike them if they come in under their national flags. That's how confident they are. They see the policies of our Rus Zion elite. They see how the general staff, under Gerasimov's leadership, is playing along, pulling punches, holding back. They see how Gerasimov protects Ukraine's entire rear, allowing the armed rabble of Ukraine to function like clockwork. And it does function like clockwork. Gerasimov preserves Ukraine's entire broadcasting infrastructure, ensuring that the population remains thoroughly brainwashed and that Ukrainians stay motivated to fight Russia. That's why, even when they're forcibly drafted by the territorial recruitment centers, they don't turn their weapons on those who sent them to die.
Воюют против России, потому что, это такое слабое.
They fight against Russia because they believe, yes, these guys are bad, but tolerable. Russia is worse. Russia must be stopped. They're genuinely convinced that handing over their country's resources to the West and dying to the last Ukrainian in a war against Russia is somehow in the best interest of the Ukrainian people. They are being deliberately and constantly brainwashed. Shut down the broadcasting infrastructure, and the entire illusion would collapse. People would begin, slowly but surely, to wake up. But no, the entire broadcasting infrastructure is carefully protected. It remains untouched. The West sees all of this. The West sees that Russia, through its Russ-Zion elite, is doing everything possible to serve Western interests. And now we come to the negotiations.
Перед переговорами все информационные СМИ повально, за исключением одной передачи, идущую не в прайм-тайм, а ночью.
In the lead-up, nearly every primetime media outlet, with the sole exception of one late-night program, Evening with Vladimir Solovyov, was actively pushing the same narrative.
Из патриотической такой позиции, там некоторые такие ведущие, так вообще так.
Even some hosts who claimed to be patriotic were echoing it, that Russia must accept the West's ultimatum, agree to a 30-day ceasefire, and that Putin must meet with Zelensky. This last point is particularly interesting. What does it actually mean for Putin to meet with Zelensky? Back in 2014, the Dorogomilovsky court in Russia officially ruled that a coup d'état had taken place in Ukraine. In other words, since 2014, there's been no state in Ukraine, no legitimate government. And yet, until 2022, we somehow continued to coexist with them and maintain de facto relations. They were carrying out genocide against the Russian people, waging war in Donbass, and still, we kept engaging with them. I just mentioned the rare earth metals deal. But what does its signing mean for Trump? This deal wasn't originally his idea. It was inherited from his predecessors, who had devised a cunning plan. If everything is placed under American ownership, then the Russians won't bomb it, because the Russ-Zion elite wouldn't dare damage anything that belongs to the United States. And that's exactly what's been happening. Just think how long it was going on. There were specific military targets being used against Russia, and they weren't being bombed because they were owned by certain oligarchs. No. How could we possibly hit that? It was only the personal will of the go-suitor that eventually forced those targets to be struck, one way or another. So, as a form of protection, they came up with the idea, make everything American-owned, and then Russia won't strike. And this idea was already in motion under Biden. So if Trump refuses the deal, they say to him, look at the great deal we struck with Ukraine. Now all those resources will be ours. And you are rejecting it? Must be because you're a Putin agent. This kind of pressure already rendered him practically ineffective during his first term, from 2016 to 2020. But if he goes through with the deal, it means he's being dragged into the war. It's like Nixon inheriting Johnson's war in Vietnam. They're pulling him in, whether he likes it or not.
Ему нужно из этой сделки выскочить. И он пытается
Trump
из
needs to
этой
get out of this
сделки
deal,
выскочить
and he's trying to find a way to do it.
Ему нужно заключение этой сделки.
He needs the deal to be formally concluded, but impossible to implement.
Заключение этой сделки
This deal can only be concluded with a legitimate leader.
Поэтому для того, чтобы повысить легитимность Зеленского,
That's why, to boost Zelensky's legitimacy, the illegitimate Rada, Ukraine's parliament. And let's be honest, Ukraine hasn't had any real legitimacy since 2014. The state functions like a gang, needs to officially recognize Zelensky. And really, why should we care how leadership is structured within a gang? Whether it's a council of warlords or a vote to choose the admin, why should we care? It's still a gang.
И поэтому даже с международной точки зрения, международного этого правового...
Even by international legal standards, there is no legitimate authority in Ukraine. Trump understands this perfectly. Still, some kind of legitimacy has to be manufactured.
Какая-то легитимность признана за Радой.
And since the Rada is treated as if it holds some, it must formally declare Zelensky legitimate. Trump orchestrates this.
Приезжает целая когорта,
But then, a whole cohort of European leaders shows up, and the Rada fails the vote. Of course, these European leaders aren't acting independently. They're under the thumb of the American domestic elite.
Второй раз продавливает, но тем не менее все равно
The second attempt succeeds. Even so, the deal remains in limbo.
И поэтому Бессент совершенно не случайно сказал, что инициатива по...
So it's no coincidence that Bessent claimed the initiative for the rare earth minerals deal came from Trump.
Потому что, ну, что
Because,
называется,
well, Trump is a man of his word in the sense that he gives it and then takes it back. There was an initiative for a rare earth minerals deal, but I'm backing out because it's unworkable.
а она невыполнима. Достигнуть ее можно лишь при одном условии.
And it is unworkable. That deal can only be implemented under one condition: if Russia capitulates, if Russia is drawn into negotiations, and, by doing so, recognizes the legitimacy of the Ukrainian government.
Пусть даже не юридически, а де-факто.
Even if not legally, then de facto, the moment Putin meets with Zelensky, the whole mechanism is triggered.
И та сделка, которая является сейчас, вот они заключили, она не стоит даже той бумаги, на которой они заключили.
The deal they signed, which, as of now, isn't even worth the paper it's written on, would instantly become a binding international document that Russia would be obligated to honor.
Именно в этом и была суть.
That was the entire point behind the hysteria about why Putin must meet with Zelensky.
Это легитимизация Зеленского. Это
It was about legitimizing Zelensky. It was about forcing Russia to recognize any and all agreements signed by Zelensky as legitimate and binding international treaties.
И вот это информационное поле перед...
And that was the information environment leading up to the official statement.
Но
But where did that statement come from in the first place?
А мы забыли, какое давление
Have we already forgotten the immense pressure that was being exerted on Russia
со всех
from all sides?
сторон. Вот абсолютно со всех сторон. Из-за рубежа, внутри России, все
From abroad and from within Russia itself, the message was the same. Negotiations are necessary, and a ceasefire must be reached.
Почему?
So why did we agree to a 30-day energy ceasefire?
Да, мы не били по энергетическим объектам Украины.
Yes,
А
we
Украина
stopped striking
продолжала
Ukraine's energy infrastructure, while Ukraine continued attacking Russia's energy facilities. Did anyone in the world take notice? No, they saw it only as a sign that Russia was backing down. And if Russia is backing down, they thought, then it must be broken completely. It must be finished off.
Сколько так наших называемых друзей, выстраивая взаимоотношения с Россией, в том числе
How many of our so-called
хотимые
friends,
для этих
while building
государств
relationships
в
with
большей
Russia,
степени, чем
often ones
Россия,
more beneficial to them than to us,
выстраивали для
have
России
created conditions that make it impossible for
взаимоотношения
Russia
на
to
международном
operate on the
уровне
international
именно
stage?
через
And how?
диктат
By insisting on the
и через
conclusion of a
мирного
peace
соглашения.
agreement.
Давайте
Let's take a closer look. BRICS is indeed emerging as a genuine alternative framework for international relations, one that challenges the Pax Americana. But even within BRICS, Russia is under pressure. China has issued an ultimatum. It demands a peace treaty with Ukraine. Brazil is demanding the same. So is South Africa.
Единственная Индия маневрирует. У нее Джамму и Кашмир — это проблема, и положение
Only
Индии
India
такое,
is maneuvering. Its position is more complex due to the Jammu and Kashmir issue. Besides, Modi is somewhat more principled, and India's internal political environment is not comparable to what Xi Jinping faces.
Но у него политическая ситуация катастрофическая. У него
Xi Jinping
много
may
приходится
even want to support Putin in some ways, but his political position is catastrophic. He has to contend with structures that represent a reincarnated British Empire. After all, the center of governance concentration, once held by the British Empire, is now shifting toward China.
Россию информационно
Russia has been so thoroughly encircled in the global information space that it's become almost impossible to breathe.
То, что Россия делает, мир не
Anything Russia does, whether peace initiatives or ceasefires, goes completely unnoticed by the world. It never gains any informational weight.
Сделали перемирие на
We declared an energy ceasefire. No one noticed. Instead, Russia continued to be accused of carrying out unprecedentedly brutal strikes on Ukraine, and so on.
объявление на Пасху не заметили.
The Easter ceasefire? Ignored. But in today's world, where there's a global campaign against religion, no one wants to draw attention to that. The Victory Day ceasefire? Also ignored. The only person who got any publicity was Zelensky, who claimed that drones didn't fly toward Moscow because Xi Jinping was there at the time and they didn't want to target him. Otherwise, he said, they would have struck hard. In short, there is no objective coverage of Russia's actions anywhere. Russia is being pushed into a position where the only outcome expected of it is capitulation. On April 30th, Kellogg announced that the United States had prepared a draft peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine consisting of 22 points. But if you read those 22 points, it becomes clear. This isn't a peace plan. It's a blueprint for the full and unconditional capitulation of Russia, complete with reparations, contributions, and the dismemberment of the country into so-called sovereign states. Everything is phrased very respectfully toward Russia. We all know how much the Russ-Zion elite loves signing these respectful agreements and then going on to destroy their own country. But we signed the agreements, so we have to honor them, they say. Excuse me, when has the West ever honored a single agreement unless it was forced to by the strength of the other side? Back when the Soviet Union still existed, when its soldiers were stationed in Europe, the West respected its agreements with Russia. But the moment those soldiers were withdrawn, the moment the West no longer felt threatened, it stopped honoring anything. And yet somehow, Russia is still expected to uphold its end of every agreement. So the Western governing elite needs to be shaken so hard they trip over their own information agenda. And that's precisely why Russia had to enter peace negotiations. Putin seized control of the narrative and flipped it.
Вы хотите каких-то там перемирий 30-дневных? Вы хотите какой-то там встречи с Путиным?
You want a 30-day ceasefire? You want a meeting with Putin? That's not even what we're talking about. What we're saying is the root cause of this war must be eliminated, and real peace negotiations must take place. But by then, the West had already locked itself into a fixed narrative. First, an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. Then, a meeting between Putin and Zelensky. And only after that, maybe negotiations. They had convinced themselves this was the only possible sequence. The entire information landscape was built around the narrative that Russia must sign a peace agreement with Ukraine, that Russia must make peace, because that's what every other country was pushing for. And in that context, Putin steps in and says, "We're ready to negotiate a peace agreement. In fact, we're ready to return to where things stood in 2022. We've always been ready." And just like that, he flipped the table. For them, everything suddenly became unacceptable. A return to the 2022 negotiations, but this time taking current realities on the ground into account, completely rules out the possibility of a meeting between Putin and Zelensky. But they've already built up momentum, and now they need to keep moving forward. And in this context, they fully understand one thing. The moment real, substantive negotiations begin, grounded in the actual situation on the ground, not a shred of the 2022 agreement will remain. There will be a new agreement concluded. The West needs a respite in the war with Russia. It needs time to solve what it sees as the problem of removing Putin. It needs time to create internal instability within Russia, to trigger economic chaos and social unrest. All of that requires time. They need to regroup, reorganize, restore their defensive positions, and resupply their ammunition. There's a film called 17 Moments of Spring. How does it begin? I'm not talking about the scene in the forest. I mean the moment when we suddenly understand that this will be a story about intelligence, about spycraft. In a cinema hall, Schellenberg and Himmler are watching newsreels. Himmler, pleased with the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, says, "Yes, we can still fight." Schellenberg replies, "Yes, Reichsfuhrer, we can still fight. But we should have started negotiations a long time ago." This dialogue perfectly captures the current situation, both for Ukraine and the West as a whole. Yes, on the front lines, there doesn't appear to be any major shortage of weapons or supplies. The West is providing everything. And then Macron steps forward and says, "We've given everything we had. We can give more than what we have. We're even sending all the Caesar self-propelled artillery systems produced in 2025. We're giving everything." And now, suddenly, the British Army makes an announcement. The British Army is relatively small, about 70,000 troops, and it had one type of self-propelled artillery system, totaling around 80 to 90 units. It has just handed over all of them to Ukraine. The British Army has been left without a single unit, literally none. Everything they had was sent to Ukraine. A conflict broke out between India and Pakistan. Pakistan holds an advantage over India in terms of barrel artillery and could have inflicted serious damage. But then it turned out that Pakistan had sent almost all of its artillery shells to Ukraine and now has nothing left to fight with, aside from the capacity to engage in limited, localized skirmishes. That's why both India and Pakistan are flinching and why the conflict is starting to fizzle out. It won't die down completely, of course. It's an unresolved issue deliberately left behind by the British when they withdrew in 1947. And whenever it suits them, they pull the strings. They're even trying now to create Balochistan. But that's a separate matter. Right now, we're addressing another issue. To keep Ukraine fighting against Russia, they're giving away the very last of what they have. Videos are circulating, filmed by bystanders, showing military convoys moving out of Germany. But all the equipment is secondhand, being decommissioned from active service units and sent to Ukraine. So yes, there's still something left to fight with, but this is no longer about clearing out warehouses. Now, they're handing over real military equipment and ammunition straight from their active forces. They're holding on to the bitter end. They need Russia to finally capitulate against this backdrop, hoping to hold out just long enough for the Russian elite to stage a coup, overthrow Putin, and sign a surrender. And against this backdrop, while they're still in a position to keep fighting, and while they do still have something left, they already need negotiations. Because if they don't start negotiations now, a total catastrophe is only a matter of time for them. And the same dynamic applies elsewhere. Take Italy, for example. We're sending all 400 of our armored personnel carriers to Ukraine because Ukraine needs them. We'll be left without any armored personnel carriers. These aren't vehicles pulled from factories or reserve depots. These are active-duty army vehicles. We're giving everything we have as long as they keep fighting. So naturally, they still have everything they need at the front for now. But their reserves are running low, and the West's current production capacity is minimal. It would need to be ramped up, but that's not happening. Why? Because Europe itself is being prepared for a war with Russia, a war aimed at total destruction. A recent NATO foreign ministers meeting was held in Antalya, where, by the way, Marco Rubio was present. At that meeting, Germany's new foreign minister, Wadeful, made a statement. Now, whether he'll prove to be a worthy successor to Annalena Baerbock remains to be seen. But one thing is already obvious. He's following the same path Ursula von der Leyen took when she was Minister of Defense. This is absolutely clear. This is absolutely clear. So what happened? Wadeful publicly declared that Germany is ready to spend 5% of its GDP on defense. We've already discussed how Western European budgets are being fully militarized. They're being prepared for war. And let's not forget, Trump had long been pressuring all NATO members to raise defense spending to 5% of GDP. Everyone resisted back then because it would be economically catastrophic. After that, only two outcomes remain: fight and die, or destroy your own country without even going to war. And everything would have seemed fine. But when the media rushed to the new chancellor, MERS, for comments, it turned out he was completely unaware. Once again, we're seeing the same kind of dialogue that occurred with Ursula von der Leyen. Let me remind you, back then, von der Leyen publicly announced that Germany would increase its military contingent in Afghanistan. Naturally, the media rushed to Chancellor Merkel, who had no idea. Von der Leyen later said, "Sorry, I didn't have time to inform you." But hold on, who actually makes these decisions? The defense minister or the head of state? Are we increasing the contingent or not? And von der Leyen clarified, "After speaking with Washington, I didn't have time to tell you we're increasing our contingent." Same thing here. After a conversation with Rubio, Wadeful announces that Germany is raising its defense budget to 5% of GDP. MERS responds, "How is that possible?" Wadeful replies, "Sorry, Mr. Chancellor. After speaking with Rubio, I didn't have time to tell you we're increasing our defense spending." Is that what you'd call a sovereign country? No, that's the very definition of a non-sovereign state.
Надо понимать то, о чем сказал Макрон. А Макрон сказал, что на Украине...
And we must understand what Macron meant when he said, "Our European security is what's at stake in Ukraine."
И он сказал, в общем-то, правильно. Но эта безопасность грозит...
And in fact, Macron was generally right. But he left out one crucial point. It's not Russia that threatens Europe's security. It's Ukraine. When the Nazi hordes, the fascist elements entrenched in Ukraine, are finally defeated and their remnants flee westward into Europe, that's when the real threat begins. Europe is unprepared, relaxed, and weakened by multiculturalism and the LGBT agenda.
Германии стало известно, что у них профессоров в учебных заведениях по гендерной политике больше, чем готовящих по отраслям там науки, техники, медицины, другим направлениям там сельского хозяйства, по всем остальным.
It was recently revealed that in German educational institutions, there are more professors of gender studies than professors in science, engineering, medicine, agriculture, and other critical fields combined.
Конкретно лишаете свою экономику.
This means you're actively stripping your economy of technologists, engineers, agronomists, doctors, and teachers of everything it needs to function. You're degrading. And we're already seeing the consequences in the economy. And in line with all of this, the last remaining viable resource, human potential, is being prepared to be thrown into the fire of war. After that, a new Middle Ages will descend upon Europe. There will be no high-tech industry left, only Wahhabi forces who will impose a new form of Islam. And once new languages and new peoples emerge across Europe, Iran will step in to impose the proper version of Islam, after which proper states will be engineered, culminating in a European Islamic caliphate. Europe understands very well what lies ahead. It understands perfectly. And it sees only one way to avoid that future. Russia must collapse. Russia must be dismembered, and its remnants turned into souvenir states, raw material appendages serving the needs of various European powers. In other words, a new colonial system would be constructed, just like the one that still exists today with regard to Africa and Latin America. And in that direction, Europe is already taking deliberate, active steps. And so, in the lead up to negotiations, tensions were escalated on all fronts. Inside Russia, hysteria was building. Putin must agree to a 30-day ceasefire and meet with Zelensky. In the West, the threats began to intensify. The Baltic states attempted to seize a tanker.
Французские самолеты с ядерным оружием, потому что из Польши долететь и
And suddenly, Poland agreed to host French aircraft carrying nuclear weapons because it's closer to bomb Moscow and Leningrad, St. Petersburg, from Poland than from France.
И поэтому сейчас ведутся как бы техническая разработка.
As a result, technical planning is already underway. Which airfields will host the aircraft? Where will the nuclear storage facilities be located?
Они конкретно планируют ядерный удар по России. При этом они конкретно
They are actively preparing for a nuclear strike on Russia, and they're doing so under the assumption that Russia won't dare respond. Why? Because they're watching our elite and the way it behaves. And this had to be outplayed. That's why it became necessary to agree to negotiations, but on our own terms. And Putin did exactly that. What followed was a brilliant diplomatic operation, as a result of which they had already locked themselves into the narrative that Putin would attend. Zelensky flew to meet with Erdogan. Trump timed his visit to coincide. Rubio showed up. They were all there.
Российская делегация приезжает с конкретной позицией. Нет.
The Russian delegation arrived with a clear position. No, we will only negotiate within the framework of the 2022 negotiations. And everything collapsed. The entire setup fell apart instantly. And then Trump said, "What? I knew Putin wouldn't come because I didn't go, and he didn't go either." Oh, really? Then why were you circling around Turkey every single day? I can drop in at any moment. I need to meet with Putin. I need to meet with Zelensky. What you really needed was Zelensky's legitimization. Zelensky, in turn, tried to provoke through bravado. You see the situation for what it is. I've often paraphrased a saying that applies to almost anyone. You can take someone out of their profession, but you can't take the profession out of them. If Putin is a judoka, a sambo practitioner, and a former intelligence officer, then that's exactly how he operates. He always uses the opponent's energy against them. He doesn't act rashly. He studies the situation, analyzes every variable, traces all logical connections, and only then does he make his move. And Zelensky, he's a performer, a clown. He follows a script. He acts out what's written for him. But he doesn't need to be a sovereign leader. There are plenty of moments caught on video showing British security handlers literally guiding him, even pushing him to stay on script. He gives a speech, steps off stage, glances back, and gets a quick shove, "Keep moving." And off he goes, subdued, "Yes, sir, I'm going." And let's not forget, he is under British control. Just recall his visit to MI6 headquarters. So in this situation, the West, in order to avoid being cornered, had no choice. After all, they were the ones who broadcast the entire setup to the world. There are too many players involved now. You can't silence them all. Just think about how many journalists they invited. If the West were to suddenly refuse to participate in negotiations in any form, it would lose. So, having completely sacrificed Ukraine, which they've been using as a pawn all along, they say, that's it. You're going to form a negotiating delegation quickly, and it's going to meet with the Russian delegation.
Делегацию, которую встретилась 16 мая, Зеленский, в кавычках, соответственно, сформировал...
The delegation that attended the May 16th meeting was formed by Zelensky only on the evening of May 15th, by which point he had already arrived in Turkey, and his team had already flown in to participate in the meetings. But as it turned out, things weren't going according to their script. They were fully locked into their script. And for us, it was critically important to demonstrate, through calm, deliberate patience, to the city and the world just how they were flinching. And that flinching was broadcast by various media outlets. Sure, they'll try to bury it or scrub it from view later. But for now, the information landscape has been shaped exactly as Putin intended. And on that note, to jump just slightly ahead, what did Trump say right after the negotiations? I'll call Putin and Zelensky. The very next comment was, I'll call Putin on Monday. But wait, you just said, I'll call Putin now. So why the sudden shift to Monday? Because when Witkoff was asked, why did you come to negotiations with Putin in Russia without your team, and without even your own interpreter? He replied, that was Putin's condition. Russia is always an independent actor. It operates either in the fleet in being format, where its very existence influences international affairs, or in the fleet is being format, where it actively enforces its policies, at least to some extent. And that's something others are forced to reckon with. And they do. They've realized they're losing, and now they know they have to act. Were we satisfied with the negotiations? Of course we were. Of course we were. And now we see the results being announced. Prisoner exchange, exchange of bodies. But here's the question. These exchanges have been happening all along. They were arranged somehow before, weren't they? So essentially, announcing them as the results of the negotiations is just a way to signal that the meeting wasn't pointless. It's a symbolic gesture, a way to keep the negotiations going and to continue outmaneuvering them on the diplomatic front. Just think about it. What do the results of these negotiations actually mean? They show that the Ukrainian delegation was sent to the table empty-handed, no real agenda, no substance. And that's exactly why, regardless of what anyone thinks of Medinsky, he still represented Russia's interests. Ukraine ended up exactly where it was always meant to be, an absolutely non-sovereign, non-independent actor. Russia, by contrast, played the role of peacemaker, while Ukraine merely acted as the side that accepted what was offered. But of course, there were plenty of fools, especially in Ukraine, proudly declaring, look, we have a delegation of 12 people and an interpreter. Meanwhile, Russia sent 4 negotiators and 4 experts. Ukraine, on the other hand, had not a single expert, just 12 delegates. And what does that tell us? It means that every clan corporate grouping in Ukraine had been tied in, bound at the level of supranational governance to prevent anyone from acting independently, to prevent anyone from trying to gain political capital by saying, someone else is negotiating, but I'm a true Nazi, a fascist, a Banderite. Follow me instead. No, they need Ukraine to remain in a tightly controlled state. And that's exactly why every major clan corporate grouping had a seat at the table. Having an interpreter present is not a minor detail. It's highly symbolic. Let me remind you, back in the 16th century, Poland was the first to demand an interpreter during negotiations with Russia. Before that, both sides had always spoken in Russian, and there had been no problems. But then, the Poles, looking to stall the negotiations, suddenly insisted on bringing in an interpreter, claiming, some words have changed on your side, and some on ours. To ensure mutual understanding, we need an interpreter. That was the mid-1500s. Now, we see the same trick attempted with Ukraine. They brought along an interpreter. But the situation for Ukraine was already a stalemate. So Russia conducted the negotiations in Russian, and the Ukrainian delegation responded in Russian as well. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian interpreter just sat there, lost, and used and completely out of place. Let me remind you, Ukrainian is a dialect of the Russian language, but one that was artificially constructed. It was deliberately shaped by inserting foreign loanwords, archaisms, and similar elements. But the most important part is the mentality behind it. In Russian, the word for agreement, соглашение, implies mutual satisfaction among all parties. In Ukrainian, however, the word is uhoda, which comes from the root meaning to please, specifically to please the person you're negotiating with. That reflects a mindset, a deeper mentality that was deliberately instilled through the shaping of Ukrainian identity. In fact, the Ukrainian project isn't new. It's over 1,000 years old. The West began at 1,000 years ago when they set out to take Russians, turn them into out-Russians, into non-Russians, and pit them against Russia. It's a long-term conceptual project. So, after holding these negotiations, what was the actual outcome? Well, the Russian delegates took it under advisement. A classic bureaucratic response. You want Zelensky to meet with Putin? All right, we'll take note of your request. Which, in plain terms, means we're making no promises whatsoever. And right after that, the Ukrainian delegates walked straight into the trap. What was another key point in the talks? Each side will present its own vision of a ceasefire. Remember what Putin said? Of course, we support a ceasefire, but there are nuances how to ensure this, that, and the other. And as a result, if negotiations continue from this point forward, which remains to be discussed, Ukraine's true plan will become clear. Not a plan for peace or a ceasefire, but a plan for war. In this sense, when they tried to lure Russia into negotiations under the banner of an armistice, their goal was to repeat the trick played on Germany in 1918, when, under the pretext of an armistice, Germany completely disarmed and withdrew its troops from, for example, French territory. And then they said, well, that's it. You've capitulated. Now we'll formalize it with the Versailles Treaty. They intended to do the exact same thing with Russia. That's why they caused such intense hysteria inside Russia. That's why the international pressure campaign was so aggressive, with even China and Brazil drawn into it. Remember when Lula da Silva flew in saying, "I'm going to knock some sense into Putin and make him meet with Zelensky"? Well, here's what actually happened. He arrived in Moscow, went straight to his embassy, had a phone call with Putin from inside the embassy, then headed right back to the airport and left. In fact, his travel time within Moscow, from the airport to the embassy and back, was longer than the time he spent at the embassy and on the phone with Putin. Russia is always sovereign when it is governed in accordance with its own interests. But the Russian elite hates Russia. They dream of selling out, betraying it. They dream of destroying the Russian people so that the country's vast resources can be handed over to the West. And in return, the West would allow them to serve slavishly, to lick its ass in exchange for Western approval. And none of what's happening teaches them a thing. Just look at the so-called relocants. How many of them left the country, condemning Russia and everything connected to it? Do people respect them? No. They're dumped, treated like shit. But they're fine with that. It's the West, after all. It's as if they have a kind of masochistic mindset, a psychological issue. Let's be honest. Many of these liberal-minded individuals are not mentally well. They're faggots. That's really all there is to say about them. And now, after receiving a brilliant blow from Russia on the diplomatic front, they've lost. We executed this negotiation operation flawlessly. Whether the negotiations continue or not is now almost irrelevant. We've already won this round. From this point forward, the opposing side, the one still using Ukraine as a pawn, enters zugzwang. Every move they make only worsens their position. The only thing they're still counting on is a coup inside Russia. That remains their last bet. That's what they're clinging to. One must understand a simple truth. Whenever the West launches a war of aggression, there's an old patriotic saying, every 100 years, the West unites and marches on Russia and ends up getting beaten by her. Each time the West starts a war, it places its bet not just on military might, but on internal betrayal within Russia, on a coup d'etat. And sometimes that bet paid off. Take the so-called Crimean War, for example. Militarily, Russia had essentially won. The West was on the verge of defeat. But then, a British doctor poisoned Tsar Nicholas I, and his son, Alexander II, squandered the victory. He couldn't consolidate it. He failed to govern the state. All of this is examined in depth in our 3-volume work, War State Bolshevism. Each imperial reign is analyzed thoroughly and critically. And of all the Tsars, only Nicholas I is recognized as a true Gosudar emperor. The others, even the so-called most Russian Tsar, Alexander III, are simply described as emperors. Now, consider that famous remark by Alexander III. As long as the Russian Tsar is fishing, Europe can wait. That sentiment mirrors Putin's current posture, and it aligns perfectly with moments like when Trump says, "I'm calling Putin right now," then follows up with, "I'll speak with him on Monday." That contrast is a concrete example of sovereign behavior, of Russia acting from a position of absolute independence. And so, to wrap up briefly, because this has been brief This is not a tactical victory. It is a strategic victory. What's needed now is to consolidate it with the next set of victories. And we must understand one thing clearly. Russia cannot win through tactical moves while facing internal betrayal from the Russ-Zion elite. Russia wins only through strategic defeats delivered to its enemies. And every one of Russia's victories rests on a single, unshakable foundation. The heroism of our soldiers, the unity of the army and the people, and the battlefield success of the Russian army in a special military operation for demilitarization and denazification. It is these battlefield victories that paved the way for this serious diplomatic triumph on the international stage, on the global stage, where Russia outplayed everyone, absolutely everyone. Now, as I said, the only task is to solidify that success. Once we do, we will pacify all BRICS members, internal pressure will disappear, and the West will be forced to shut up. It has enough of its own problems, so it had better shut up. That's how it is.
That's all for today.
Well then, all that remains is to say goodbye, and to remind you that many things are incomprehensible to us not because our minds are weak, but because these things do not fall within the circle of our concepts. And we must understand, in the past, in order to become a person and a citizen, it was enough to be able to read, write, and count. But today, to become a person and a citizen, one must know how complex social supersystems, such as states, are governed. Such knowledge is provided by only one source, the works of the internal predictor of the USSR. For the complex and powerful maneuver currently unfolding across the entire world, not just in Russia, we have prepared a 3-volume work titled War State Bolshevism. The first volume, State, explains that not all states are truly states. It clarifies the difference between a historical state and an engineered state, defines what a state actually is, and explores many related concepts. The second volume, War. War is a set of measures aimed at seizing another country's natural, energy, and human resources. This is the only accurate definition of what war truly is. This volume explains how wars are conducted, and how one country can defeat and take over another without any battles on the field. The example of the Soviet Union, how it collapsed without a single major battle, proves that victory can be achieved without military conflict. The third volume, Bolshevism. At all times, Russia has been saved by a unique phenomenon of Russian culture, Russian Bolshevism. That is precisely why Bolshevism is so hated by all of Russia's enemies. And that is why all opponents of Bolshevism align themselves with figures like Hitler and other historical enemies of Russia to prevent Russia from emerging as a sovereign and self-determined actor on the world stage. In addition to this 3-volume set, our partners have published a collection of analytical notes titled Fleet is Being as part of a series about the world of crooked mirrors. These analytical notes expand upon the content presented in the trilogy. They have also published a supplementary volume to the first and second editions of War State Bolshevism. This supplementary volume is now part of the current third edition. It includes a significant amount of material that was missing from the first and second editions, and is now incorporated into the third. A book was also written titled State Symbols and State Sovereignty. Just as in the military, one could determine a service member's place, status, and capabilities within the armed forces by their insignia, so too, from the 15th to the 20th century, a global system of state flags was developed. This system reflects the international hierarchy of states, indicating a state's status and what capabilities it holds in the world. Through this lens, it becomes clear why the original Russian red flag of the USSR represents a self-determined and absolutely sovereign state, whereas the current state flag, the white-blue-red tricolor, is the flag of a dependent, non-sovereign colonial state, essentially a raw material appendage of the West. In addition, our partners are currently publishing a series titled The Library of Conceptual Knowledge. The first volume is on economics. This work explains how the economy actually functions and helps readers understand the actions of the central bank and others who are working to keep Russia a raw material appendage of the West. The second volume is on imitative and provocative activity. Today, there are many public opinion leaders who guide their audiences in one direction or another, and often disappointment follows. The public opinion leader turns out not to be who they claim to be. This book on imitative and provocative activity helps readers determine whether a person truly is who they present themselves as, or whether it's just an image, while in reality they are engaged in entirely different activities. The next volume is the sufficiently general theory of governance, the backbone of the conception of public safety. The following volume is Ida Pushkin, which explores the conceptual content of Pushkin's works. Connected to that is the volume Matrix is Different from Matrix, which covers matrix-based governance. The next book is a collection of analytical notes on fascism, titled World Fascism. It is effectively a reissue of a 1923 collection, written when fascism was already a reality, and here it is described and theorized in full detail. The next volume is on how to live as a human being, about how the economy and society functioned during Stalin's era. And most recently, our partners have published another book titled On the Introduction to Analytics. This work explains what analytics is and how to practice it. It includes examples of how, using the cultural characteristics of different nations, supranational governance is exercised. Practical guidance is given on how to develop your own analytical abilities. Specific exercises are included, and by solving them, you can build your analytical skills. The book also presents examples of brainstorming conducted using an unsuspecting public in order to carry out national and supranational governance. Through this, readers can come to understand many things, from the purpose of various television series to the so-called Zhirinovsky phenomenon, and much more. By working through the recommended tasks, you can strengthen your analytical abilities and become an independent governor. All that's left for me is to say goodbye and wish you all the very best. Peaceful skies above and happiness. I'll see you next time.